You should start packing soon, my daughter-in-law said the morning after my husband was buried, as if she were reminding me about a routine appointment instead of erasing me from my own home. I remember the way the sunlight came through the kitchen window, soft and ordinary, falling across the same oak table where my husband and I had shared breakfast for over 40 years. Nothing in that light suggested that my life had just been quietly dismantled overnight. I was standing at the sink, rinsing a coffee cup I hadn't finished, when Rachel leaned against the doorway, arms folded, her voice calm, almost gentle. That was the part that stayed with me. Not anger, not cruelty, just certainty. Behind her, I could hear my son Daniel moving through the hallway, his footsteps familiar, steady, unchanged. He didn't come into the kitchen. He didn't need to. Silence can agree with things words never have to. I dried my hands slowly, carefully placing the cup back where it belonged. For a moment, I let myself look around. The cabinets we had repainted 3 summers ago. The small crack in the tile near the stove that my husband always said he would fix next weekend. The house still held him in 1,000 quiet details. But already, I could feel it slipping out of my hands, not with force, but with intention. I understand, I said, my voice even softer than I expected. Rachel gave a small nod, as if we had reached a reasonable agreement. That was what they thought this was. An arrangement. A transition. Something practical. Daniel finally stepped into view then, but he didn't look at me directly. He glanced at Rachel first, then at the floor, then somewhere past my shoulder, as if eye contact might complicate things. It's just easier this way, Mom, he said. Easier. I repeated that word silently, letting it settle. I had spent decades making things easier for him. Easier mornings, easier choices, easier consequences. It was strange how quickly that history could be rewritten into inconvenience. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I didn't need to argue. Not yet. The truth was, they believed I had nothing left. No leverage. No understanding. No place to stand. And I let them believe it. I turned back to the counter, wiping away water that wasn't there, giving them the quiet they expected from me. Grief makes a convincing disguise. People see what they want to see in it. Weakness. Confusion. Dependence. Rachel stepped further into the kitchen, already shifting her attention to the mail stacked near the fruit bowl, flipping through envelopes as if they belonged to her. We'll help you figure out where to go, she added, almost kindly. I watched her for a second longer than necessary, memorizing the ease in her movements, the ownership she hadn't earned but had already claimed. Then I looked away. That won't be necessary, I said gently. She paused, just for a moment, then continued sorting the mail, unconcerned. To her, it sounded like resignation. To Daniel, it probably sounded like acceptance. Neither of them noticed what it actually was. Permission. I walked past them without another word, down the hallway that still smelled faintly of my husband's cologne, into the bedroom we had shared. His jacket was still draped over the chair where he had left it. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap, listening to the muted sounds of their voices in the kitchen, low and practical, already discussing timelines, logistics, next steps. They were planning a future that no longer included me. And still, I said nothing. Because silence, when used correctly, isn't surrender. It's strategy. And they hadn't realized that the one thing I hadn't lost when my husband died was control. The house sounded different that night, not louder or quieter, just rearranged in a way that did not include me anymore, as if every room had shifted its loyalty while I was not looking. I stayed in the bedroom longer than I needed to, sitting in the same place, letting the silence settle into something I could understand, something I could use. Down the hall, I could hear Rachel's voice again, low and steady, followed by Daniel's occasional responses, shorter now, more certain, as if decisions were being made in real time and I was no longer part of the process. At some point, a drawer opened, then another. The faint scrape of something being moved across wood. They were not waiting. That was the first thing I noticed. Not even 24 hours after the funeral, and already they were reorganizing a life that had taken decades to build. I stood up slowly and walked to the closet, running my hand along the row of jackets my husband had kept in perfect order. He had always been particular about small things. The alignment of hangers. The way receipts were folded. The way he locked the front door every night, even when we lived in a neighborhood where nothing ever happened. I used to think it was habit. Now, sitting there in the quiet, I began to understand it differently. He had been careful, not anxious, not controlling. Careful. I reached for the small wooden box on the top shelf, the one he kept tucked behind a stack of old photo albums. It was still there, exactly where he had left it. I did not open it yet. Instead, I carried it to the bed and placed it beside me, feeling the weight of it, solid and deliberate. The voices in the hallway grew closer, then stopped just outside the door. I could hear Rachel again, clearer now. "We should start going through the documents tonight," she said. "There is no reason to wait." Daniel hesitated, just for a moment. "Maybe give her a few days," he replied, but there was no conviction in it. "We are giving her time," Rachel said, her tone still measured, still reasonable. "But we need to stay organized." Organized. That word again. Everything framed as efficiency, as responsibility, as if what they were doing was not removal, but management. I sat there without moving, listening to them decide how my life would be handled. And still, I said nothing. After a few seconds, their footsteps moved away, back toward the living room. A cabinet door opened. Paper rustled. The sound of someone flipping through files that did not belong to them. Not yet. I looked down at the box beside me, then finally lifted the lid. Inside were exactly what I expected. Neatly arranged envelopes, each one labeled in my husband's careful handwriting. Dates, account references, names I recognized and some I did not. Beneath them, a single folded document, thicker than the rest. I did not read it immediately. I did not need to. I already understood enough. He had not left things exposed. He had not trusted chance. And more importantly, he had not trusted them. I closed the box again and set it aside, my movements slow, deliberate, almost ritual. In the next room, Rachel laughed softly at something. A brief sound, quickly gone, but it carried through the walls with surprising clarity. It was not cruel. It was not loud. It was comfortable. That was what made it unmistakable. She believed she had already stepped into the space I had just been pushed out of. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard we had maintained together year after year, the trimmed hedges, the small garden along the fence line, all of it still intact, still orderly, still mine, at least for now. I let my reflection settle into the glass, studying it for a moment. The lines were deeper than they had been last year. The posture slightly more careful. But there was something else there too. Something they had not accounted for. They saw grief. They saw age. They saw someone who would step aside because it was easier than resisting. And I let them see exactly that. Because the truth, the one thing they had overlooked, was not written in those documents or stored in that box. It was simpler than that. I was still paying attention. And that was going to matter far more than they realized. The next morning began the way most mornings had in this house for years, with light slipping quietly through the curtains and settling across the hardwood floors. But there was something altered beneath the surface, something precise and intentional that made every sound feel like it had been placed rather than happened. I was already awake when I heard movement in the kitchen, the low hum of the coffee machine starting before I even stepped out of bed, a routine my husband had followed for decades, now taken over without pause, without acknowledgement, as if habits could be reassigned as easily as furniture. When I entered the kitchen, Rachel was standing at the counter, dressed neatly, her hair pulled back, already composed for the day ahead. She did not look surprised to see me, which meant she had expected me to remain in the background, to wait, to adjust. "I made coffee," she said, gesturing toward a mug that was not mine, placed slightly off to the side. I nodded and took a different cup from the cabinet, the one I had always used, filling it slowly, noticing how she watched the movement without commenting, as if deciding whether or not it mattered. Daniel sat at the table, scrolling through something on his phone, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had already accepted the new arrangement. He glanced up briefly. "Morning, Mom," he said, then looked back down, the conversation already complete. I sat across from him, wrapping both hands around the warmth of the mug, letting the silence stretch without trying to repair it. On the table between us were several stacks of papers, neatly aligned, not yet touched, but clearly prepared. Rachel followed my gaze. "We started organizing some of the documents last night," she said, "just to get a sense of what needs to be handled." I did not reach for them. I did not ask what she had found. Instead, I took a sip of coffee and set the cup back down with the same care I had used for everything else since yesterday. That makes sense, I replied. Her expression softened slightly, not with kindness, but with confirmation. She believed I was cooperating. Daniel shifted in his chair. We can go through everything together later, he added, though his tone suggested the decisions had already been outlined. I nodded once. Of course, I said. The conversation ended there, but the room remained full of unspoken assumptions. They were moving forward, step by step, building a structure that placed them firmly in control while leaving just enough space for me to feel included. It was careful. It was efficient. It was incomplete. After breakfast, Rachel gathered the papers into a single folder, tapping the edges against the table to keep them aligned, a habit she had likely learned somewhere else, somewhere that required precision. I am going to make a few calls, she said, already turning toward the living room. There are some things we need to verify. Daniel stood as well, following her without hesitation. Neither of them asked where I would be. Neither of them needed to. I remained seated for a few seconds after they left, listening to the distant murmur of her voice as she spoke on the phone, professional, controlled, confident in a way that suggested she was already speaking on behalf of something she did not yet own. Then I stood, picked up my cup, and carried it to the sink, rinsing it slowly, watching the water run clear. Every movement felt deliberate. Now, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. When I finished, I dried my hands and walked back down the hallway to the bedroom, closing the door behind me with a soft click that separated their version of the house from mine. The wooden box was still where I had left it, waiting without urgency. I opened it again, this time removing the top envelope, running my fingers over the familiar handwriting before sliding the document out. The paper was heavier than standard stock, official, structured, precise. I scanned the first page, then the second, not rushing, not reacting, just confirming what I had already begun to understand. Names, accounts, legal terms, all arranged in a way that did not require interpretation. It was clear. It was intentional. And most importantly, it was mine. I placed the document back into the envelope and returned it to the box, closing the lid with the same quiet finality as before. In the other room, Rachel's voice carried again, sharper now, asking questions, clarifying details, moving forward with a plan that had already begun to take shape in her mind. I stood there for a moment, listening, then turned away, walking toward the closet, straightening a jacket that did not need straightening, aligning it with the others, restoring order in a way that felt both familiar and necessary. They believed they were organizing what had been left behind. They believed they were stepping into something unclaimed. And I let them continue, because the further they went, the clearer everything would become. I did not need to stop them. I needed them to show me exactly how far they were willing to go. I did not go to the living room when Rachel called out that she had scheduled a meeting, and I did not ask who she had spoken to or what she had already set in motion, because by then I understood something that had taken me years to see clearly. That control is rarely taken in a single moment. It is transferred quietly, piece by piece, until one day it no longer belongs to you. I stayed in the bedroom a little longer, then moved through the house slowly, not to avoid them, but to observe what had changed overnight. The small details told me everything. The mail had been moved from its usual place to a tray near the entrance, something we had never done before. The keys that had always hung beside the kitchen door were gone, replaced by a different set, neatly arranged, unfamiliar. Even the thermostat had been adjusted, set a few degrees lower, not enough to notice immediately, but enough to signal that someone else had begun making decisions without asking. These were not large changes. That was the point. They were careful, gradual, designed to feel natural. I walked into the living room and found Rachel seated on the couch, a notebook open on her lap, her phone resting beside her, her posture straight, focused. She looked up when she saw me, offering a small, practiced smile. I spoke with an estate advisor, she said, as if updating me on something routine. There are a few steps we should take right away, just to make sure everything is handled properly. I sat in the armchair across from her, folding my hands in my lap, giving her my full attention without interrupting. Daniel stood near the window, arms crossed, listening but not contributing, his presence more supportive than engaged. We need to consolidate accounts, review ownership structures, and make sure nothing is left unprotected, Rachel continued, her voice steady, confident, already operating within a framework she believed she understood. I nodded slightly, not because I agreed, but because I wanted her to continue. She turned a page in her notebook, glancing down at her notes. There may also be some assets that are not immediately visible, she added. Those will require a bit more investigation. I watched her carefully then. The way she chose her words, the way she positioned uncertainty as something temporary, something she expected to resolve. She believed there were things she had not found yet. She was right about that. Daniel shifted his weight, finally speaking. We just want to make sure everything is secure, Mom, he said, his tone softer now, almost reassuring. It is a lot to manage. I met his eyes for the first time that day, holding his gaze just long enough for him to feel it, then looked away. I am sure it is, I replied quietly. Rachel closed her notebook with a decisive motion. We can go over everything together later this afternoon, she said. I will have a clearer picture by then. I stood slowly, smoothing the fabric of my sleeve, maintaining the same calm rhythm I had kept since the moment she first told me to leave. Take your time, I said. She nodded, satisfied, already turning her attention back to her phone, already moving forward. I left the room without another word and walked toward the back of the house, stepping out onto the patio where the air felt cooler, steadier, unchanged by the rearrangements happening inside. The garden looked exactly as it had the week before, each row intact, each plant in its place, a reminder that not everything shifts just because someone decides it should. I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, then reached into my pocket and took out a small card I had placed there earlier that morning. A name, a number, nothing more. I had not called yet. There was no urgency. That was the advantage of understanding something before anyone else did. You are not reacting. You are choosing. I turned the card over once, then slipped it back into my pocket, not because I was hesitating, but because I knew exactly when it would matter. Inside the house, Rachel continued her calls, her voice carrying faintly through the open door, confident, organized, convinced that she was building something from the ground up. She did not realize that what she was building had already been designed long before she arrived. And I did not need to correct her. Not yet. Because the more certain she became, the less she would question anything that did not immediately fit her plan. And that was when mistakes were made, not from carelessness, but from confidence. I had seen that before. I had lived beside it for years. The difference now was that I was no longer inside it. I was watching it from the outside, with enough distance to see exactly where it would begin to fail. And when it did, I would not need to explain anything. I would only need to be ready. By the time the afternoon arrived, the house had settled into a rhythm that no longer included hesitation, only movement, decisions, and the quiet assumption that everything would continue in the direction Rachel had already chosen. I found them at the dining table, the same one where we had shared holidays and ordinary evenings, now covered in neatly arranged folders, legal pads, and a laptop that did not belong to me. Rachel sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her expression focused, while Daniel sat to her right, flipping through a stack of documents with the kind of attention he used to reserve for things he cared about. They both looked up when I entered, not surprised, just acknowledging my presence as something expected but not essential. Perfect timing, Rachel said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. We were just about to go over everything. I took my seat without rushing, placing my hands calmly on the table, my gaze moving over the papers without reaching for them. There were more documents than there had been that morning, more structure, more certainty. She had been busy. I spoke with the advisor again, she continued, turning the laptop slightly so Daniel could see the screen more clearly, though not enough for me to read it. We need to move quickly on a few items to avoid complications later. I nodded once, giving her the space she clearly expected to fill. She slid a document toward me, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table. This is a temporary authorization, she explained. It will allow us to manage certain accounts on your behalf while everything is being sorted out. Her tone was measured, patient, almost instructional. Daniel glanced at me briefly, then back at the paper. It is just to make things easier, he added. Easier. The word returned again, consistent, rehearsed, carrying the weight of justification without ever addressing what it replaced. I looked down at the document, scanning the first few lines without changing my expression. Legal language. Structured permissions. carefully defined access that extended further than the title suggested. It was not unusual. It was not unexpected. It was precise. I let a few seconds pass before speaking. I would like to review this more carefully, I said, my voice steady, without resistance, without agreement. Rachel did not hesitate. Of course, she replied, though there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight tightening in her shoulders, as if something had not moved as smoothly as she anticipated. But it would be better to handle it today if possible. Timing can be important with these things. I lifted the document, holding it lightly between my fingers, then set it back down in front of me. Then it should be done correctly, I said. The room grew quiet for a moment, not tense, just recalibrating. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling through his nose, not frustrated, but aware that the pace had changed. Rachel closed the laptop halfway, her focus narrowing, adjusting. We are trying to help, she said, softer now, but still firm. I met her gaze, holding it just long enough to acknowledge the statement without accepting it. I know, I replied, and I let that be enough. I gathered the document along with the others she had placed near me, stacking them neatly, aligning the edges the way my husband used to, precise, intentional, controlled. I will take these and look through them tonight, I added, rising from the chair before either of them could respond. Rachel watched me closely, evaluating, measuring, trying to understand whether this was delay or agreement. Daniel said nothing. I turned and walked toward the hallway, the weight of the papers in my hands steady, familiar, almost reassuring. Behind me, I could hear the faint sound of Rachel reopening the laptop, already adjusting her plan, already moving forward with what she believed was still under her control. I did not look back. I did not need to. Because for the first time since this began, something had shifted, not in the house, not in the documents, but in the space between what they expected and what I allowed. And that space, quiet as it was, belonged entirely to me. That evening, I did not join them for dinner, and no one came to ask if I would, which told me more than any conversation could have, because absence, when it goes unacknowledged, reveals exactly where you stand in a room you once belonged to. I remained in the bedroom with the documents spread out neatly across the bed, each page aligned, each section reviewed with the same patience I had learned over years of managing things no one else noticed. The language was familiar, structured to sound protective while quietly transferring authority, the kind of wording that depends on speed and trust to be effective. They were counting on both. I read each line carefully, not searching for something hidden, but confirming what was already clear, that these papers were not designed to include me, only to pass through me. After a while, I set them aside and reached for the wooden box. Again, opening it with the same steady motion as before. This time, I removed the thicker document from the bottom, unfolding it fully and placing it flat in front of me. The weight of the paper, the clarity of the print, the deliberate structure of each clause, all of it reflected the same careful thinking my husband had applied to everything he built. There was no confusion here, no room for interpretation. The trust had been established years ago, structured to activate automatically, with defined roles, defined access, and most importantly, defined limits. I was not being granted control. I already had it. I let that understanding settle without reacting, without rushing to the next step, because the value of information is not in discovering it, but in knowing when to use it. Outside the room, I could hear faint movement again, the low sound of dishes, a chair shifting, the ordinary rhythm of a household continuing without disruption. They believed they were moving forward. That belief was still intact. I folded the document carefully and returned it to the box, closing the lid and placing it back on the shelf where it had been, exactly where it belonged, untouched in appearance, unchanged in position. Nothing needed to look different yet. I gathered the papers Rachel had given me and placed them into a single folder, not mixing them with anything else, keeping them separate, contained, exactly as they had been presented. Then I turned off the light and left the room, walking quietly down the hallway, not toward them, but toward the front of the house. The air felt cooler near the entrance, still, undisturbed, as if that part of the house had not yet been claimed by the decisions happening in the back. I paused for a moment, then reached for the small table near the door where the phone sat, picking it up without hesitation this time. The number on the card was simple, direct, familiar in a way that suggested it had been used before, not often, but intentionally. I dialed slowly, listening to each tone, not feeling urgency, only alignment. When the call connected, I did not need to explain everything, only enough. "This is Margaret Whitmore," I said, my voice steady, unchanged. "I would like to schedule a meeting regarding my husband's estate." There was a brief pause on the other end, then a response that carried recognition, not surprise. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore," the voice replied. "We have been expecting your call." I allowed a small pause, just long enough to register the phrasing, then continued. "Tomorrow morning would be best." The details were arranged quickly, efficiently, without complication, as if this step had always been part of the plan, simply waiting for the right moment to begin. When the call ended, I placed the phone back exactly where I had found it, leaving no indication that anything had shifted, no visible sign that a different process had just been set in motion. From the living room, Rachel's voice carried again, lighter now, almost relaxed, as if the day had confirmed everything she needed to know. Daniel responded with a quiet agreement, his tone easy, settled. They believed the structure was already in place. And for now it was. I turned away from the door and walked back down the hallway, passing the dining room where the folders still sat in neat stacks, untouched since earlier, waiting for signatures that would not come the way they expected. I did not stop. I did not adjust anything. Because the most important changes are the ones no one sees while they are happening. And by the time they do, it is already too late to move them back. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet precision that felt almost rehearsed, as if each movement in the house had already been decided before anyone took a step. And for the first time since everything began, I left before they could begin their routine. I moved through the hallway without turning on the lights, the early daylight enough to guide me, enough to keep everything in its place, unchanged, undisturbed. From the living room, I could hear nothing yet, which meant Rachel had not started her calls and Daniel had not taken his place at the table. That was important. Timing, I had learned, is not about urgency. It is about absence. I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me, the cool morning air settling around me in a way the house no longer did. The drive to the office was short, familiar, the same route I had taken countless times with my husband, though never for this reason. The building itself was unremarkable, clean lines, neutral tones, a place designed to handle things quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to what passed through its doors. Inside, everything was ordered, calm, structured in a way that felt consistent with what I had already seen in the documents. I gave my name at the front desk, and there was no confusion, no delay, only recognition. "They are expecting you," the receptionist said, her tone polite, practiced. I was led to a conference room where the air felt still, controlled, insulated from anything outside it. When the attorney entered, he did not introduce himself with uncertainty or hesitation. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, extending his hand, his expression steady, respectful in a way that suggested he understood more than he needed to say. I sat across from him, placing my hands on the table, the same way I had done at home, the same calm rhythm, unchanged. "I believe you have already reviewed some of the materials," he continued, opening a folder that mirrored the structure of the documents I had found. I nodded slightly. "Enough to understand the framework," I replied. He inclined his head once, acknowledging the answer without pressing further. "Your husband established a comprehensive trust structure several years ago," he said, his voice measured, clear. "It was designed to ensure continuity, but also to limit unauthorized access." Unauthorized. The word settled quietly, without emphasis, but it did not need any. "And the control?" I asked, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to hear it stated. He met my gaze directly. "Remains entirely with you." There was no pause after that, no qualification, no condition attached. Just fact. I let that sit for a moment, not reacting, not shifting, only absorbing the confirmation in a way that felt both expected and final. He turned a page, sliding a document toward me. "There have already been preliminary inquiries made regarding certain accounts," he added, his tone unchanged. "Those requests have been noted but not authorized." I looked down at the paper, recognizing the references, the timing, the pattern. Rachel had not been waiting. She had been acting, carefully, quietly, but not invisibly. "And if those inquiries continue?" I asked. He folded his hands lightly on the table. They will be blocked, he said simply, unless you instruct otherwise. I nodded once. The decision already formed before the question had been asked. Do not block them, I said. He did not react immediately, which told me he understood the implication. You would prefer to monitor? He clarified. Yes, I replied. I would like a complete record. He inclined his head again, making a note without comment. No surprise. No concern. Just adjustment. That was the difference between assumption and understanding. One reacts. The other prepares. We spent the next hour reviewing structures, access points, limitations, each detail reinforcing the same conclusion, that nothing had been left unprotected, nothing had been left open, and most importantly, nothing had been transferred without my consent. When the meeting ended, I stood, smoothing my sleeve the same way I had done at the dining table, the same controlled motion, unchanged. If there is anything further, he said, you only need to call. I gave a small nod. I will, I replied. Outside, the air felt warmer now, the day fully awake, moving forward without hesitation. I returned to the car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, not because I needed time, but because I understood exactly what had just been confirmed. They believed they were close to securing everything. They believed the structure was already shifting in their favor. And now, I knew exactly how far they were willing to go to make that belief real. I started the car and pulled out onto the road. The route back home as familiar as ever, unchanged in distance, unchanged in direction. Only now, I was not returning to react. I was returning to watch them continue. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, unchanged from the outside, quiet, composed, almost reassuring in its stillness. But I knew better now than to trust appearances, because the most significant shifts are rarely visible from a distance. I stepped inside without making a sound, closing the door gently behind me, and immediately I could hear Rachel's voice from the dining room, sharper than before, more focused, the tone of someone working toward a conclusion rather than exploring a possibility. I did not go in right away. Instead, I paused in the hallway, just out of sight, listening without needing to lean closer. That cannot be right, she was saying, her voice controlled but tight around the edges. There has to be another account, something that is not listed here. There was a brief silence, followed by the faint sound of her tapping keys, then flipping through papers. Daniel spoke next, quieter, less certain. Maybe it is just delayed, he said. Or not everything has been processed yet. Rachel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signals impatience being held back rather than released. No, she replied, firm again. It does not work like that. I stepped forward then, letting my presence be known without announcement, and both of them looked up at the same time. Rachel's expression shifted quickly, smoothing itself into something composed, something controlled. You are back, she said, as if the timing of my return had no relevance to what she had just been saying. I nodded once and moved toward the table, my eyes passing over the documents, the laptop screen, the scattered notes that were no longer as neatly aligned as they had been the day before. Something had already begun to resist her. Did everything go well this morning? She asked, her tone light, almost casual, but her attention sharper now, focused on me in a way it had not been before. I took my time answering, setting my keys down carefully, adjusting the position of a chair before sitting. It was productive, I said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. You met with someone? He asked. I looked at him briefly, then back at Rachel. I did, I replied. There was a small pause, not long enough to be called tension, but long enough to shift the balance of the room. Rachel closed her notebook slowly, her fingers resting on the cover as if she were deciding whether to open it again. That is good, she said. We have been trying to get a clearer picture of everything. I nodded again, acknowledging the statement without confirming it. I imagine you have, I said. She held my gaze for a moment, then glanced down at the papers in front of her, her posture adjusting, recalculating. There are still some gaps, she added. Some assets that are not showing up where they should. I reached forward and lightly touched the edge of one of the documents, not pulling it closer, just enough to mark its place. Sometimes things are not where you expect them to be, I said quietly. Daniel shifted again, looking between us, sensing the change without understanding it. Rachel's expression remained steady, but her eyes narrowed just slightly, the first real sign. that something was not aligning with her assumptions. "We will figure it out," she said, her voice firm again, re-establishing control. I did not respond to that. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. The same position I had taken before, the same stillness, unchanged. The difference now was not in what I was doing, but in what I knew. They had started to encounter resistance, small at first, just enough to slow them down, just enough to create questions they could not immediately answer. And that was exactly where I needed them to be. Not stopped, not blocked, just uncertain. Because uncertainty makes people reveal more than confidence ever does. Rachel reopened her notebook, flipping to a fresh page, already adjusting her approach, already moving forward. She was not giving up. I had not expected her to. Daniel sat back, quieter now, watching rather than participating, his earlier confidence replaced by something less defined. I let the silence settle again, not filling it, not guiding it, just allowing it to exist. Because for the first time since this began, they were no longer moving ahead without resistance. They were beginning to question the ground beneath them, and I had no intention of interrupting that process. I only needed to let it continue. The following morning did not begin with conversation, but with preparation, the kind that fills a space without needing to announce itself. And when I entered the dining room, everything was already arranged with a level of intent that no longer tried to appear casual. The folders were stacked in a more deliberate order, the laptop open and angled differently, a legal pad positioned directly in front of Rachel, as if she were expecting to document something important rather than explore possibilities. Daniel was already seated, his posture more rigid than it had been the day before, his attention fixed on the table rather than drifting. They both looked up when I stepped in, and this time, there was no pretense of ease in Rachel's expression. "We need to finalize a few things today," she said without delay, her tone direct, controlled, no longer softened by courtesy. I took my seat slowly, placing my hands in front of me, the same calm position, unchanged, and waited. She slid a new set of documents toward me, more structured than the previous ones. More complete, as if she had spent the night closing gaps she believed she could control. "These will establish full management authority," she continued. "It will allow us to move forward without delays." Daniel glanced at me briefly, then back at the papers, his silence now less neutral, more expectant. I looked down at the documents, reading the headings, the clauses, the language that no longer tried to disguise its intent. It was cleaner now, more decisive. She had adjusted. That was to be expected. I let a few seconds pass, then reached for the top page, lifting it just enough to confirm what I already understood before placing it back down. "You have been very thorough," I said quietly. Rachel held my gaze, searching for agreement, or resistance, or something in between. "We need to be," she replied. "There's a lot at stake." I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without challenging it. "There is," I agreed. The room fell into a brief silence, not empty, but weighted, as if something had reached a point where it could no longer continue in the same direction without being addressed. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table, her posture no longer relaxed, but anchored. "If you sign these today, we can resolve everything by the end of the week," she said. I looked at her then, fully, not as I had before, not observing, but meeting her with the same level of clarity she believed she had already achieved. Then I turned my attention to Daniel. "Do you understand what these documents do?" I asked. He hesitated, just for a moment, the first real pause I had seen from him since this began. "They organize things," he said, his voice uncertain now, less aligned with Rachel's certainty. I let that answer settle before responding. "They transfer control," I said calmly. Rachel's expression tightened slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition that the conversation had shifted in a way she had not initiated. "They allow us to manage things efficiently," she corrected, her tone firm again, but now carrying a sharper edge. I did not argue with her wording. I did not need to. Instead, I reached into my bag and removed a single document, placing it on the table between us, not sliding it toward anyone, just setting it down where it could be seen. The paper was thicker than the others, the print precise, the structure unmistakable. Neither of them touched it at first. Rachel's eyes moved over the first line, then the second, her posture becoming still in a way that was entirely new. Daniel leaned forward slowly, his attention narrowing, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to realization. I kept my hands folded, my voice even when I spoke again. Everything you are trying to manage, I said, has already been structured. Rachel did not respond immediately. Her eyes moved across the page again, slower this time, more carefully, as if each line was rewriting something she had already decided. This was not in any of the records we accessed, she said finally, her voice quieter now, not uncertain, but recalculating. I inclined my head slightly. Not everything was meant to be accessed that way, I replied. Daniel looked up at me then, really looked, for the first time since the conversation began. You knew about this? He asked. I held his gaze, steady, unchanged. I know what belongs to me, I said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. Rachel sat back slowly, her notebook still open in front of her, but untouched, her pen resting where she had left it. For the first time, she was not writing anything down. She was reading what had already been written long before she arrived. And I did not need to say anything more, because the structure she had been trying to build no longer applied. It never had.